Wealth is one of the biggest questions in all of human history. If you look around, you'll notice that some nations are incredibly wealthy and some are incredibly poor. But why is that? Is that due to the fact that we have rampant corruption? Is that due to the fact that we have rampant exploitation? Or is it that some nations are blessed, some nations are cursed? Or is it that the destiny is in the hands of the beholders? Today on Geopolitics and Tyberius D, we're going to be talking about the generating of wealth, what makes nations wealthy, what makes them poor, and it's going to be a fun ride. Come join us. Welcome back, everybody. Today on Geopolitics, Tyberius D, as the intro stated, we're going to be talking about the generating of wealth, looking at the efficiency and the scarcity that generates all the things that makes all of these things matter for you and me today. Of course, you can see the live stream chat, whether you are on YouTube and Twitch. You can see that in there. Please behave yourselves. I would really appreciate that because the mods will have to hurt you. Giving a general outlook of where the nations are overall in a world is that you see this map, and this is generally per capita. You can break it down, is that there are some nations that are wealthy, there are some nations that are ridiculously not. And the question is, why does that happen? Well, how do you make wealth? I'm going to hit all these topics one by one as we go down. Some of them are very important, some of them really aren't at all. But yeah, does climate do anything? Does the temperature, does the weather change anything? Does education change anything? Does the skills and trained abilities? Does exploitation matter? A lot of people within the leftist community argue that the West is rich because they basically screwed everybody else over. Geography, does that matter? Having resources to supply. How about infrastructure? Getting A to B easier. And then, of course, social safety nets. That one will be incredibly political, and I'm not going to mince words about that one. But we'll get there when we get there. Of course, that'll be the last one. Let's look at the world climate map. You do not understand what this probably means. This is a world Köppen map, and this is all the different climatological zones. If you don't understand this map, don't be worried, because I will explain it for you. The thing I want you to look at is look at this map and look at the particular color arrangements. The next map I'm about to show you is where everybody lives. And you will notice that there are some areas that absolutely have some overlaps, and we'll go break those down. Here at first, you see where everybody lives. You may see some very strong correlations here. You may see some that you're kind of like, well, you know, this color might have been there. I don't remember anymore. What I can basically tell you from looking at this map, and I'm going to eliminate two places right off the bat. Anywhere that is largely tundra or subarctic, you don't see hardly anybody live there. You can literally see on that map, or on the last map, where the colors changed to where they got really, really cold in Canada and really, really cold in Russia. It literally, you can see the lines on the map where those were. And of course, you had the big Sahara Desert, and you can see where a lot of people aren't there as well. A few other places on the map there you can definitely tell people are very sparse and devoid of. Let's break these down. Continental zones. Continental zones are weird, and we'll show you what these look like on the next slide, so don't worry. They usually have either hot summer zones or cool summer or warm summer zones. Now, the hot summer zones are really good during a hot summer because you can have a wonderful agricultural crop, you can have a wonderful time for building, and basically anything productive. You go outside, you go participate, you go do stuff, right? And if you're in any of these areas, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You go out for the summer, if you guys and gals, swimsuits, bikinis, you go do all the wonderful stuff. When you're in the winter, it gets cool and it sucks. But there's a really good balance here. In the summer, and spring and fall, you have these very strong warm periods that are allowing you to go out and interact with the world and be very productive. And once you get to the cool, you actually have a natural rest period. So whether you are having a construction job or, you know, you're in farming, what have you, unless you're literally working inside at a desk, you probably have some level of respite or rest or taking it easy because you just can't be that productive, or you need to stay inside because you get hypothermic. This actually, as an example, in agriculture, gives better pest and weed control. You may notice that there's a lot less bugs and weeds when it's freezing outside, and that actually helps cut down on your chemical costs in dealing with in dealing with pests and herbs. So in a general sense, that's actually a really good balance. There is also the warm summer zones. They're a lot like the hot summer zones, but they're a little problematic. They're actually a little bit more productive because you can get so hot in some of these or hot summer zones that during about 12 to 3 o'clock, it actually can be a little problematic to be working. But in these zones, that doesn't happen. The problem is that it's shorter. So, you've got this really nice time in these hot summer zones, and it's largely between the end of March, first week of April, and it goes all the way till about the 3rd to 4th week of October. You got a really good time there to be productive and have a capacity to go out and do things into the world. The warm summer zones are quite a bit shorter. You usually don't really get fired up, and I'm not talking about just agriculture, I'm talking everything, right? You don't want to go outside, you don't want to be productive and meet people unless you're just one of those weird Canadians that wear shorts when it's 40 degrees. Your warm summers are largely starting in May, usually about that first week in May, and it's pretty much done by the second week of October. Your winters are colder, and you're even less productive, and they last longer. It's still a good climate overall. Like, this is southern Canada in a general sense. It's a nice place, but you really don't want to be stuck around for winter, and the summer just doesn't last long enough. We're going to ignore the subarctic zones in this one, but we're going to hit this map. So this is the area that we're talking about in general. The colors that you're looking for is the light blues, the lighter blue and the lightest blue. The sad part is that the warm summer areas that I'm talking about is actually the lightest blue, and you'll notice that North America is literally the only place that has it. You've got a little outstretching there in Ukraine and southern Russia. The problem is that there's an active shooting war going on there right now. So yeah, bad. You also have a bit of Romania, but it's not nearly as big and as continuous as the United States is. It's broken, it's fragmented up. The United States literally has all of it in North America. Obviously, if you expand that a little bit, you get these cooler climate zones, the warm summers. This is literally from everything in southern Germany all the way out to the Russian Urals. And of course, this is southern Canada. It's actually a really nice climate. It's not you could live there comfortably, but you will not be as climatologically competitive with the warm summer. Warm summer just kind of gives you a couple extra bonuses that go further. Hot summer area zones I wanted to break down. The area in China is actually really nice there, but it's really highly elevated. Parts of it is. So the long and the short here is that it does have some more continental, warm, hot summer weather, but it's not as productive for a few various reasons, but I'm not going to get into that. This is your warm summer areas, and I wanted to break that down. Kind of shows you where that is. That's most of Canada. That's northern United States, Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, but also Poland, Ukraine, pretty much all of Sweden, that kind of deal. Southern Sweden, the productive, nice part of Sweden. And of course, this is the Russian heartland. So you guys get an idea of what I'm talking about here. This is continental climates, and they're really generally nice outside of the horrible freezing places. Next zone is the temperate zones. They're a little different than the continental zones because they are technically on the continents, but they are largely dealt with because of their access and proximity to the ocean. They are actually really cool because they have temperature gradient control from being right next to the ocean. Basically, large bodies of water always have this weird effect to where they will climatologically control everything around them. Of course, the bigger the body of water, the more control it has. When you are dealing with a continent like Europe that is really right next to the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean, those have very strong climatological effects on the area around them. And it generally, just in a nutshell, keeps everything hotter. It's a lot harder to cool off water than it is to cool off land. And so, basically, if the land starts cooling off, then the heat from the water will literally kind of rise up and it'll start sweeping on the land. And that happens every day and night. If you're anywhere near the coast, you'll notice that the wind changes there about 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. when the sun is going down and then the sun's coming up. You'll notice the inflows and outflows. It's one of the most beautiful things in the world. Okay, it also benefits from access to the ocean. Of course, if you are not a landlocked country, you can access the world markets and be able to interact with the world in a way that others cannot. Really strong ability in being and not being landlocked, and basically if you're in a temperate zone, you probably are very close to a major body of water. Basically three areas here that are really important. Number one is the Mediterranean zones. Basically, this is where Western civilization comes from. This is Rome. This is Greece. It's a little weird. It's like a hot summer continental climate, but it's drier. And to kind of give you an idea, of where I'm talking about. Not only is this Italy, not only is this Greece, this is actually not Southern California, but like Central California. These are places that get water, but they don't get a lot of water. You can grow like crops, but you're talking more like wheats and olive oil, or I'm sorry, like wheats and olives, and not things like corn. You can do it, but you really got to irrigate it to make it work. And it's usually near mountains. We'll get to that part later. That's more in the geography section. The oceanic zones, these are a little bit of the opposite effect. They are like the hot summer continental zones that I was talking about, really productive, but they're actually wetter. They tend to be monsoonic, or very similar to that in some regard. And instead of basically getting the average like 40 inches of rain a year, they get 60. It's not a bad place to live, but you will have some issues. Kind of giving you an idea where I'm talking about. If you live in Seattle, if you live in Portland, Oregon, this is what I'm talking about. You're going to have as many cloudy days as you do sunny days in the year, if not even more. Not specifically that, but that's kind of general. And then you got the subtropical zones. This is where East Asian civilizations largely all come from, or at least their core roots of. This is southern China. This is India. There's a problem. You're getting hot in the summer. Depending on where you are, this subtropical zone is actually the southern United States, and if you get a decent amount of rain, you're good and it's fine, but you are getting it so hot that you really don't want to be out in the middle of the summer. The problem is that you get places like India where it's significantly drier. The good news is that some of these areas are so hot that you can grow all year round, and they actually get the water to make it work. India is the really big exception here, or not the exception here, but the affluence here. And I want to put this in perspective. You can see the Mediterranean climates, they are in yellow. So, Greece, Turkey, most of Spain, Italy, and then, of course, most of California. These are those drier areas I was talking about. The light greens are France, Germany, the United Kingdom, more like Seattle. The light greens and the light yellows are places that are, really good for human habitation, but the reason that they tend to be that color is they have a lot of mountains around them that actually screws with the climatology. And, basically, they're usually either incredibly wet or they're incredibly near arid, and that proves to be very problematic in some regards. The lighter greens, the darker greens, that's where there's a little bit of a hiccup here. These areas are hotter. In fact, the more shaded green that you see in India, it's hot enough and wet enough you can grow crops all year round. But the other trait of that is that it's just so hot during the summer months that this area will fry. In fact, we've been seeing this year in India in the last couple of years, summer's hitting 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not pretty in some of these places. Basically, during the summer months, you will start to cook. Not good. China is a little bit less like that. It's why it's a little bit of a lighter green. It's great when it comes to the climate overall in general. It's more like a hot summer kind of thing. The reason why it's that is due to the local topography. We'll get there in the geography section, but the long story in a nutshell is that you would want to live there, but you can't get out and you can't get in nearly as easily. Let's break it down real quick. I keep forgetting that we actually have these breakdowns. I put them in here for a reason. Forgot I had them. Yeah, Mediterranean climate zones. These are really nice. You'll notice that this is kind of where Western civilization kind of comes from the Levant, from Italy, from Greece, from Turkey. And of course, we have that here in North America in the great states, California. This is largely Long Valley. It's not super wet, but it's not super dry either. And you can tell when you get down to like Fresno, as an example, it gets a little too dry. But overall, this is a place where you can make a habitable life for yourselves. Just, it's a little finicky. Of course, this is kind of where a lot of Western civilizations kind of come out in the last 200 years. And this is, this is Vancouver, this is Seattle, and I'd say this actually stretches down into Portland. But you also have areas of pretty much northern France, all of the United Kingdom, and, Western Germany is this area. If anyone wants to know why there's such a big blob there in Western Europe, it's largely the North Atlantic current, which takes the heat from the Southern Atlantic and dumps it all off in the Northern Atlantic. It makes a lot of rain, makes a lot of storms, keeps the area generally wet, but the problem is that y'all know how there's that whole stereotype within England that it's raining all the time. This is actually why. You've got a lot of heat, but it's dumped in the form of vapor and water moisture. So you can have a growing season here, but it's not actually as productive as some other places. But the good news is that if you were dealing with this zone, it actually would be a lot more like northern Canada, and so it's actually more productive, ironically enough. But then we get to the subtropical zones, and this is a weird break. Where you have the southern United States And kind of the southern China is that it's actually very productive for agriculture, but it does get pretty obscenely hot. And then you get the other zones that are even like this weird oblong shard of gray or of green. Yeah, you're getting obscenely hot. It's bad, and it's drier too. That's actually the really bad part. The lighter greens are significantly wetter. You can grow crops and you can irrigate if you need to, and generally you're never going to run out of water. The part of India that you're looking here in Africa that you're looking here is that you can grow quite a bit of crop, but it gets hot and it's incredibly dry. Remind you that this is in India, part of where the monsoon will happen, or the effects of the monsoons happen. So let's move on to the last part here. Tropical zones. This is a really big mess, and I'm going to put it into a very particular dynamic. You will never have cooling cuffs here. It's too hot. The good news is that basically no cooling, no like a lot less clothing. You're never going to need to wear a Dawn jacket. And your caloric intake is actually going to be lower because you don't need the inner body heat to keep your body metabolism working. The bad news is that this is oppressive levels of heat. It basically in midday of summer, you're not functioning. I think you all know how this works. It's the tropical rainforest. This is where malaria comes from. This is from where Ebola comes from. These are places that are incredibly conductive, not only to like various forms of life, but I'm going to say destructive forms of life. It is stuff that humans actually don't habitate well with. A lot of these places are either incredibly wet or incredibly dry. They're not kind of mixed. And so either you have forest zones, which is kind of like the Amazon rainforest in Indonesia. This is a tropical rainforest. You generally tend to die horribly here, or you have a very hard life. I do want to talk about Indonesia in the geography section because there's a reason why they're able to make it where a lot of other people would never. Monsoon seasons, they've got a problem. This is kind of Western India. We'll get into that here in a second. It's largely wet for 4 months and dry for 8, and that's kind of a pain. If you don't have irrigation and combined with flood control, you have a serious problem because you're literally flooding for 4 months and then you're dry for the other 8. If you can manage to make a water control system, you will be incredibly strong for it. And this is actually one of the big things that has allowed India to kind of turn the corner, is that they've been able to get some of this under control with engineering. Last is the savanna zones. These are what you think of. They're dry grasslands. They will grow quite a bit of stuff, but basically they're wet for 3 months and dry for 9. So by the time you get to the end of the year where you need to get another rain squall, there's barely anything alive still left. This is where we see a lot of the major migratory species. If they live there, they migrate from place to place to place. Things like antelope, as an example. These are areas that we're talking about in a nutshell. The dark blues are basically where you notice that, except for Indonesia, no one lives here because you will die horribly. This is largely disease-ridden. This is incredibly hot, and it's incredibly wet. And I didn't really talk about it earlier. When you get this much heat and this much moisture on one place, whatever you build largely just disintegrates very, very quickly. This area is incredibly hard to deal with as a building material because you have to pay more money and materials to get the same amount of effect unless you have something that's incredibly good at water resistance. And the likelihood is that if it's water resistant, it's not heat resistant, or both. You're usually paying out the money in building costs, or you're literally up front because you need something that's long lasting, or you're constantly having to refurbish and rebuild in those blue zones. And we're going to break these down, of course, for you. The light blues are the tropical zone, or I'm sorry, we'll just do this. Dark blues, you don't want to live here. Already hit that. Indonesia works. We'll talk about why in geography. Tropical zones, or the monsoon zones, are the places where they get a lot of water and then they don't. We already addressed what that area is, so I don't need to really reinforce that too much. But these are places that you are kind of living on the fringe. Savannah is actually where humanity largely comes from. We don't work well here. That's actually the ironic part. If a lot of people kind of wonder, it's like, hey, look, we come from Africa. We are used to that climate. It's over large sections of the world, but you'll notice that every one of these sections that it covers is actually usually incredibly poor. And the reason why is that when we humans came from this environment, we're adapted to it, but adapted to survive to it. We don't thrive in it. And so, moving on to the next area, we don't operate here. And so, When we left Africa, when we started getting into Asia, when we started getting into Europe, you will notice that we really start going on escape velocity. We rapidly improve the things that we humans were able to do. Agriculture doesn't come from Africa. It comes from Asia. Animal husbandry doesn't come from Africa. It comes from Asia. Major powers of the world, particularly in the last 2,000 years, are largely European and Asian. This is not on by mistake. The climate is something that we absolutely respond to, even though that we thrive in a climate that we originally didn't kind of come up to. So, talking what works. Continentals are actually probably the most productive. They've got a really good temp balance. We also have rivers because of how often they rain, and that is incredibly important to locomotion and geography later. And of course, we have the continental geography. We'll hit that as well, but we'll be talking about resources. Temperate climate zones, they're usually decent, and they have the access to oceanic travel, which allows them to interact with markets that others would not be able to. That's incredibly good. It's usually warm and hot most of the year, so you don't have to pay for cooling costs and that kind of effect, and that's good. The issue with these general areas is that they're either a little too wet, a little too dry, or they get a little too hot. And then, of course, tropical is just, it's too hot. There's actually some studies on that, I'm going to get a little spicy here, but generally, one of the reasons why we see differences in IQ points for people around the equator is they literally are so hot that their brain isn't operating at, I call it peak efficiency. Heat will literally screw with you. You all know what heat stroke can do. That's literally like a passive level of heat stroke that you can get into. So yeah, we come from here, but we're not good there. This is the value added chain. You all may kind of get what's going on here, but if you need an explanation, you start with extraction services, right? This is agriculture, forestry, crude oil, you know, your various ores. You go through refinement, purification, processing, fabrication. You get better stuff as you level up, right? And so you can basically follow the flow chart here. You go all the way from agriculture with basic stuff, or forestry, and when you're done with it, you are got the components that gives you your cell phone, your home, an excavator, oil rigs, all of these hyper complex assembled pieces that allow life to work. And of course, some people have already pointed this out, that this cycle can go multiple rounds, where you get the excavator and the oil rigs, which goes back into the extraction services, which makes you even more productive and more prosperous. Anytime that you can get the cycle to reboot is usually a good thing, or more productive. And this is kind of why the value-added chain is overpowered. Basically, this is the power of skills. Transformative skills that allow you to turn something that is either marginally useful or not really useful at all into something that is useful, or if not necessary, is one of the key components into generating wealth. Every time you go through one of these steps, you make wealth, you make value. That is why it's literally called the value-added chain, and it's important. This chain is powered by education. It has some serious issues with it. I want to be very clear about that, but it's absolutely overpowered. At first, it's got upfront costs. There's two general particular ways to educate someone. First way is basically the apprenticeship program. That's what we've seen throughout most of history. The second way is what we call liberal arts, and this is generally like a substantive education in multiple topics. So let's break this down. Apprenticeships are usually cheaper. They're productive, not necessarily from the start, but pretty quickly. You're going to be an apprentice. They're going to tell you how to do your job, and so you might not be productive at the start, but they're going to encourage you to be productive as quickly as possible, because this is your job. This is what we are teaching you to do. So, you know, first year, you may not be very productive at all, but the second year, you're productive, and then as you go on, it gets better as it goes. These are usually shorter. Sometimes they're just a couple months. I think the longest that I've ever really found is a couple of programs that last about 6 years, but these are far more of, hey, I'm your apprentice, I will learn and train under you. Sometimes it's certified, sometimes it isn't, but basically you prove by the method of your work, hey, I know what I'm doing, please hire me, I run a business, whatever. You have a transformative skill, go out into the world and make money. These work really well with Type 2 and Type 4 labor. If you don't know what those are, Type 2 labor is industrial labor. This is the stuff that you do in manufacturing, right? So if you're working on the assembly line, you come on, you have no idea, right? You are apprenticed with somebody, and they will teach you how to do something pretty simple. And then if you want, you can continually scale up in that process to where you learn what this part is, then this part is, then this part is. And, you know, eventually you get to the point where you can you can design the damn car or the refrigerator or whatever you are. This is the modern middle class was actually built on this kind of mentality. It looks like for the fourth industrial revolution that we're going forward through, that programmable industry will actually do a lot of this. If you want to learn to code, ironically enough, the best way to do it is actually not going to a university, spending a bunch of money. It's that you apprentice under somebody, you start with something like Java, start with something pretty simple, and you work your way up. And while universities will do this, you can actually make more money and get far more resources out of this by basically apprenticing out for somebody who is either like a technician or a certified guy. I know I'm speaking a little nebulously here, but I've talked to way more people that say go with the apprenticeship system on this one. It just works out better. You're productive quicker. You're not bogged down by massive student loan debts, whatever. And it makes sense. You learn this program, then you learn this program, then you learn this program, then you start writing the programs, and then you start manipulating the programs. You scale up. Makes sense. All right, liberal arts. It's expensive. Number one, because it's a huge amount of topics and it's a long time. Most places that have a general liberal arts education, and this is most of the developed world, go for 10 to 20 years. Now, obviously, 10's a little low and 20's quite a bit high, but what I'm talking about here is kindergarten, grade school, all the way up through high school, and then eventually sometimes you go to university or, college. This is a lot of time, and you're not productive during any of this. You're not usually working when you're doing any of this. And so it has a massive problem where you have the better part of your productivity at all capacity just dropped off the face of the earth. And until you are done with this system, until you're vetted by the system, hey, this is what you can do, go, great, deal. Why does this work at all? And the answer is it has a serious leg up on apprenticeship for one very particular reason. And that is a general broad-based education across multiple sectors. As an example, you apprentice as a welder or a metallurgist, right? You can tell me all you want to know about copper and steel and aluminum and all these things, right? You can become a master class worker in that kind of field. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem with something like an apprenticeship in that regard is that what happens if I tell you, hey, should I get a vaccination? Hey, is the earth flat? The long and the short is about this, and I hate to meme, but this is what we've actually seen as reality. Without a broad-based general education, you can't answer these questions, and you're a lot more susceptible to not only personal, social, and political influences that can screw you over because you just don't know the answers to them, but also is that if you need to cross-examine or cross-train in something to bring it in your industry. As an example, somebody was talking about a computer program that I got involved with where they wanted to understand how agriculture worked, and they wanted to develop a model for how that crosses works. If you come from an or that kind of background, or you're educated in how basic agronomy works, where it's like, hey, you plant the seeds, you got to have some fertilizer, you got to make sure it's watered. The more you know about other things, the more you can cross-contaminate these ideas. In fact, this is how we got the idea for continental drift, is that some guy said, hey, it looks like the continents kind of slide around, kind of like glaciers do. Maybe that's what happens here. Ridiculous idea. It turned out largely 90% correct. It was just skating on the continent skating on a giant plaster of lava instead of ice. This is the power of the liberal arts education. I know a lot of people like to mash on them. Having people who know the basics in health makes them healthier. Having people know the basics of mathematics makes them compatible to do a large assortment of jobs. Having basics in X, Y, and Z all helps. Science, history, all these things matter. And having a more rounded person, while it takes longer, while it's more expensive, means that you can cross-train, cross-equip, and be more productive in general, because you don't have to go through an entire new apprenticeship program if you decide that, no, I don't really want to be a welder. I would really like to work in finance. And so this actually works really well with type 1 and type 3 labor. Actually, type 1 is actually extraction. So if you're in mining, if you are if you are in forestry, agriculture, that kind of thing, these are really good because you're either dealing with something that you're largely doing manual labor with, or you need to be a boss who is like telling people, hey, we need to organize this to this to this, and that requires a completely different skill set. Same thing with the service industry. You'll notice that there's not a lot of mid-skill service industry jobs. There's a few out there, like teachers, but that's actually the rare minority. Most of the times it's you're some kind of teller or, person who is a cashier or a server, that kind of thing. Doesn't require a lot of skill, but you are going to make money off of this, and you need to know that. Or You rapidly jump the shark and you're, a central level manager where you're helping run the restaurant. It requires a completely different skill set or some associated skills, but you need a broad-based education to figure out how people are going to interact versus one-to-one versus macro level. And that's where liberal arts actually do pave their way. Not going to say one or the other is better. They both have basically serious pros and cons. So, yeah, in a general sense, let that one sink in. But long-term gains, we gotta hit this real quick. Education absolutely is incredibly transformative. It is amazing. The skills that are transformative, and I want to hit that, transformative reach huge gains. What are transformatives? These are skills that change the environment of the interactions that you have. I know that sounds a little bit broad-based, but what am I talking about when I say that? If you can advertise and you can go, hey, this guy's got something you want, that changes the environment of the interactions because now they want to interact with you. Entertainment. If I, Tyberius D, am going up to you guys and I'm like, hey, I would like to explain this stuff to you. If I can do that in the most Bueller way, then you probably aren't going to want to be here. You don't want to learn anything. But you all will remember that one teacher you had in high school that was really passionate about what he did. You may not have had it, but you felt it, and it made you want to listen. And so whether it's Tyberius D here on Twitch and YouTube, or whether it's that high school teacher that you had or that college teacher that you had, being entertaining brings people into you, and you can serve a very positive function with it. I will suffice it to say that that doesn't unfortunately go one direction. If you look at our good friends in the sports entertainment industry, you get paid a lot of money for doing absolutely nothing besides entertaining people, and it's very sad. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I do want to hit two more real quick. Number one is energy. It's capitalized for a reason. Energy is huge. Basically, if you are the person that can help keep the lights on, even if there's a lot of you, your skills and your resources are incredibly important because you make the modern world work. And so if you can work at a power plant or what have you, you might have to retool because natural gas is like taking over coal as an example. But if you can help keep the lights on, you will make money. Or unless your government screws up. The last one that I want to hit is generalization. Generalization is uniform production. I know that sounds a little weird, but it has very, very rich rewards. Back during the days of World War II is that we had things that we needed to make. Tanks, guns, all this other stuff. Some of these things are incredibly complicated. But if you have the skills of generalization where you can like, hey, look, we can do this with this, we can do this in this way, and we can do this in that way, that makes you productive. And what we have found during this time is that we were able to cut down on 40% of the average labor to make guns, tanks, and airplanes and ships, to where we literally had ships that are 10,000 ton, luggers that were going across. We called them Liberty ships. We were making them in a month. Because we figured out how to generalize it to where it's like, all right, we put this part together in this way. It saves us 10% time on this, and then we'll attach it to this thing, and we'll save 10% of the time on here. Example, instead of riveting, you weld. Things like that work very well. So the generalization actually is a huge, huge multiplier in how you can be a productive member of society. If you can figure out how to do something just a little bit better than the next guy, I'm not going to say you're the next Jeff Bezos, but you have something seriously going for you. The other major note here that I want to hit is that education is pretty much permanent. Education isn't something you can just come steal, you can hit somebody. The only weakness it has is that either you are incapacitated or you're dead. So, you are so incapacitated that you are basically, crippled or disabled. If you can't move your arms anymore, then even if you're educated, you may not be able to use that educated skill. And of course, death is very, very straightforward. I want to be very clear here that education is actually incredibly powerful, though, in combating incapacitation. Say you have a welder who is educated to do that, and he does it very well, but he is paralyzed from the waist down to where he can't weld, or paraplegic where he's paralyzed from the neck down. Yeah, that person is technically disabled, but he still has a mind to where you can train that mind to do another task, where you can say, all right, he's a welder, he's going to be retrained into being an accountant or dealing with things that helps him still be a productive member of society. I'm very sad that we don't do that to the degree that we can, but that's a whole political conversation, but we will come back to that. We're revisiting this map for a particular reason. Notice where the rich people are. Notice where the poor nations are. We're going to talk about exploitation. I'm going to just take a big old crap on my leftist friends here. There's a very little correlation between the former colonies and exploitation. And I want to kind of go down the list here and like explain what I'm talking about. Australia, Canada, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, and the United States. They're all former colonies. Some of them far longer than others. Some of them far more recently than others. So, you want to say like, oh, well, the United States hasn't been a colony since 1783 or whatnot. By the way, that's when we got our independence. That's when the war ended. Yeah, okay, cool. Let's talk about South Korea. Literally a colony of China or Japan for the better part of 1,000 years. And then once given independence and basically helped by the United States, is that it is now one of the most populous areas on the planet. It's one of the most economically productive areas on the planet and has served very, very well. So if you're just openly being like, oh, colony, we just took everything from them, South Korea would like to give you the middle finger. On the other side of that, you have poor nations, which have either been colonial powers recently or in the past, or have a complete difference in breakdown. So let's break these up. China once was one of the major powers until the century of humiliation. Even after that, has been able to build itself back up again. So, like, you're talking about areas in a country that went to zero and is now building back up. So, even if it has been exploited, they're now the number 2 economy in the world. So, it's something that you can clearly recover from. India was a major power, basically got taken over by the British for a long time there during the East India Company. A lot of people talk about how there was literally $140 trillion worth of wealth was stolen from India. Like some ridiculous claims like that I've seen, and people argue this nonsense. India is still one of the top 10 economies in the world. Yes, it is still incredibly impoverished, but I'm going to make the claim during this that the exploitation had little to do with that. I'm going to talk about one of the colonial powers writ large, Russia, one of the great imperial powers of the world. It's still one of the poor nations in the world. Some people will be like, oh, well, the West did it. No. They were the mighty Soviet Union. They were the rival superpower to the West. They collapsed due to their own inadequacies. This isn't a matter of exploitation. Hell, the Russians exploited everybody within their own aegis and under their own system. In fact, you can make the argument very strongly that being an exploitative power actually is more likely to cripple you than it is to help you. And the Russians are a very strong result of this. South America, Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to make a very clear distinction on these two, because South America was largely ruled and quote-unquote exploited by the Spanish for the better part of 300 years. Sub-Saharan Africa had the Scramble of Africa starting in the late 1800s and was decolonized in the 1960s. Significantly less amount of time. Significantly poorer. If exploitation is a major hindrance and a major benefactory into why a country can succeed or fail, why is it that Spain is actually weak enough after exploiting basically South America for 300 years that it's still considered a developing nation in the modern world? It literally is that poor, while Sub-Saharan Africa is actually significantly poorer than all of their South American counterparts. There is no nation in South America that is poorer than the vast majority of Sub-Saharan Africa. These correlations do not line up at all. If people are going to say that wealth is generated by exploitation and taking from others, you are wrong. Let's talk about transportation. Let's talk a little bit about geography. All right, so this is the wealth generated by what we call scarcity. If anyone isn't familiar with scarcity, the whole idea here is that people want things, but things are either one, in a limited supply, which is actually the vast majority of the time, or 2, they are in limited locality. And this is what we're going to focus on more, but actually we're talking about both here. Number 1 is that if you have things, people want the thing more often than not, right? So if you've got a nice house, people want nice houses, but if you can't get enough nice houses, then somebody gets a nice house and somebody doesn't. A lot of this comes down to transportation. Can you source whatever it is to where it needs to go? And as we'll get into this writ large, but example, Middle Eastern oil makes oil incredibly wealthy for them. But it's not the Middle East that benefits or that profits from the oil. It's actually the end users. It's China, it's Japan, it's South Korea, it's Taiwan. And this is what this map here perfectly illustrates. Long story short, the further away you go, the more that you can facilitate the growth of wealth because of a particular thing that you source. So if you have oil here or tin here or aluminum here is that if it's 1,000 miles away and somebody wants it, you can command quite a bit of a profit for those things. But you'll notice that there's a dead zone here on this map, and that is because there is a balance. Let's look at the other side. Obviously, the further away you go, the more it costs to transport it, and there is a equilibrium point. The further away you go, the more that it costs to ship it there, and there is a point where you get into a dead zone to where the gain versus the cost doesn't work out anymore. Of course, it doesn't actually look like these circles, but you get the general idea. This notion is called the balance of transport. I gotta thank Peter Zion for waking me up to this particular idea, but the long and the short is that this is absolutely true. The wealth that you can gain and command by transporting something versus the amount you have to spend to actually get it there is what fuels all the transport industry, and it's incredibly important. Why is it that certain areas do far better with transportation than not? Welcome to the slope problem. We're talking more geography, we're more talking about topography now, but they're all interrelated, like at the hip. Here's a 3% slope, a 6% slope, and a 9% slope. Obviously in this graphic, makes a lot of sense, but you all know what I'm talking about here. You ever go for a walk? You go up a hill? A lot harder the steeper the hill is. Basic simple. If you gotta run an engine, you gotta run a train, the higher you go, the quicker you go, that more that slope is there, the more energy you have to expel to get from A to B. And if you notice, the world isn't really that flat. You've got some places here that are a little flatter, you got some places here that are a little hillier. Where those hills are, radically, not even a little bit, radically changes the economic relationship you have with your neighbor. And so if you have a place that's relatively flat or it slopes at a marginal angle, you can deal with that. And you can be incredibly economically productive. If you're a place that literally has to deal with a cliff to get to your neighbor, you are going to be at a massive economic disadvantage to anyone who is generally in a flatland. So let's break down the parts of the world that are flatter and what are not. Do not worry necessarily about the color here. That's not the issue. Whether it's green, whether it's darker, whether it is like the whites that you see in here, that's not what you're concerned with. It's the abrupt change that you're looking for. It's the slope. If you see a color consistent over an area and it shades a little bit, that area is generally quite a bit flatter and quite a bit more economically productive because you can get from A to B quicker, simpler, and easier. If it's one of these deals to where you literally are at a green sliver and then it jumps right the hell up to these dark brown areas, you've got a problem because you're literally off the coast of a cliff. And you will notice certain areas here are literally jagged. You literally look out over the horizon, you see flat, 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 flat. Oh, wow, there's a massive mountain there. There's certain areas that are incredibly like this. A significant part of the African coast is exactly like that. There's a few breaks there. If you want to access Africa, there's only like 3 or 4 places you can do it very well. Everywhere else is literally, you get onto the coast, you drive inland for 5, 10, maybe 20 miles, and you look straight up. Crap. Actually, this is Brazil's problem in a nutshell. Everything that they need to go through is going through their Argentine rivals. You can basically put together really quickly who's competitive here, who's not. We'll talk about this more in the conclusions, but look at North America, look at Northern Europe or Central Europe if you want to talk about it, and look at where India is versus, and I'll put it this way, India, China, largely Eastern America, Eastern North America, and Central/Northern Europe. Versus look at Southern Africa, look at the Tibetan Plateau, look at Iran, look at Turkey. You can definitely see who's got advantages here and who doesn't and why. And you'll notice that if you actually look at where the people live and where the highlands are or the lowlands are, most of the people who live in the lowlands have a significantly higher prosperity per capita over any other rivals. Norway's probably the biggest exception there, and Japan is, and we can get into that later. Africa. I'm just kind of going to zoom around and kind of look at where everybody is. Africa is a massive series of plateaus. Plateaus are actually the worst of any geographic thing. A mountain you can dig through. You know, if you've got a mountain or two or a mountain range, you can find some passes. You can find some places that, you know, if you really want to put the money into it, you can dig from point to point. But a plateau is worse Because if you just got this giant continental slab that's literally about a mile up and there is no slope to even get up it, either you're moving an entire Rhode Island worth of dirt to make it to where you can get up that, or you are physically cut off from the rest of the world. And you can definitely tell where some of these matter more than not. I want to show you, if you look down there at Cape Town on the southern tip of Africa, literally, you come off the boat onto the ocean, you see the port, and off in the distance you can see the mountains about 10, 20 miles away. That mountain, it doesn't have a range that you can just kind of punch through. There's actually one in there, but it's actually where a pass is forming. Overall and in general is that a lot of these coastal areas have a point where you can interact, but then you have to jump up 1,000 feet of cliff or 3,000 or almost a mile up to interact with. That's most of southern Africa in a nutshell. It's a plateau with a giant cliff that keeps you from interacting. You can kind of see by the shading here in general, there's not a lot of easy changes in Africa. There's a few coastal plains that are there, but just overall and simple as it doesn't go hilly like, western Kansas. It's a lot more like, if you guys are familiar with Denver, flat, 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 flat. Oh. Let's kind of zoom around a little bit. Certain areas of Asia are incredibly prosperous. You can see that you have Mesopotamia there, aka Iraq, relatively flat. Got some rivers going through it. This is where modern civilization largely came out of, remind you. The Indus River Valley, the Ganges River Valley, these are the cores of India. This is literally why India is named it. It's from the Indus River. Remind you that it's still going through a desert, but this is where most of their civilizations came out of. Chinese civilization comes from the flatlands here. Chinese triangle, this is actually a bit misshapen because of the curvature of the earth. This is where most of China's real identity comes from, is this triangle here that forms in the flatland. It's largely, I can't remember these two rivers, but it's what used to be called the Yellow River and the river that goes through Shanghai. These rivers are the major breadbasket feeder areas of modern China and basically all of Chinese history. This is where the vast majority of anyone who rules China sets up their capital. This is where the most powerful areas usually tend to be. Everything else in the hinterlands is basically a giant cliff that you have to interact with, and this is why Chinese history is, we're the center of the world. We are the Middle Kingdom, because it's really hard to get to China from anywhere else unless you take a boat. Japan largely comes from the Kanto Plain. It's a nice little area in Japan there. It's that giant green area that you may notice as Greater Tokyo. That's most of actual Japan outside of interlinking with the rest of the little coastal plains that are there. But you're talking about 40% of all the Japanese people, or it's either 40 or 60, I apologize, live in the Kanto Plain. And that is the economic heartland of Japan. Without it, they would be screwed. The big one I want to hit is Indonesia, down there in the south. Coastal area, largely flat, except for periods of mountain chains and a plateau there on Borneo. But it's all connected to the ocean. And so the reason why you have the override to where it's climatologically screwed overall is that you have open access to the world because you are basically permanently a naval power, and it's relatively flat. So once you get up onto the dock is that you don't have to go up a cliff to interact with the wider world. This is why Indonesia is successful. This is why it's got 200 million people, is that it interacts in a way that has one geographic climatological negative balanced out with a geographic positive. And so while these are highly populated, doesn't have a lot of wealth, but it's doing okay. Australia is largely screwed by climate. You'll notice that everyone lives pretty much west of the mountain chain here. That's because the mountains largely screw the continent up because it scrubs everything west of them dry. If it wasn't for that, Australia would be a powerhouse. But everything that's in there that's a relative flat land that you would want to build on is part of the outback. And you can't grow anything in the outback. It's really hard to mine anything in the outback. You can't source water. It's really hard to build transportation. Bad. New Zealand's great because it kind of breaks all of the rules. Basically, New Zealand's the opposite of Indonesia. You've got a great climate, but you have a terrible topography. That's why New Zealand is doing well. Climate matters a lot. Australia is doing well because their climate is really good in the topography that they've settled in. They settled largely in the right place. But if you're wanting Australia to be a major power, you've got to water the outback somehow. which they're actually talking about. Europe, I think, is pretty explainable. It doesn't have a lot of the river systems on here like other places, and I don't know why, but it's dotted with rivers that you can move across and move around on. We're going to talk about that here in a couple slides, but the long and the short here is that Europe's flat. Now, granted, some parts are flatter than others. If you look at that transition that you see there in Germany, you don't really get to the Alps until you get to southern Germany. You got some highlands there, you got the Black Forest, but it doesn't get super hilly. Northern Germany is where modern Germany actually comes from. You've got the Rhineland, which is the economic heart, and you've got Brandenburg, which is the political heart of modern Germany. You have Poland here, you have Russia here, you have the Baltic states, you have Sweden, you have France, you have Netherlands, you have Belgium. You have largely the United Kingdom on this one, or more particularly England. This is the major powers club for the vast majority of the last 400 years, is all on this giant plain. And if you look, it's because it's largely pretty well level on the gradient. It doesn't transition in elevation quickly. There's a few parts that are, kind of off there, but Russia, it's like Kansas. Parts are hilly, parts are flat, but you're not looking at any kind of major mountain ranges or hills in any of it. We'll talk about why Russia has some issues going later on, but you can probably figure it out. Climate. The kind of nation that kind of breaks all this, if you want two of them, Hungary should be doing a lot better than it is. It's in a good climate, it's in a good geopolitical place, and so is Romania. We'll have to do some erratas on this to actually talk about why certain nations fell, and that's why you need to watch the country spotlights here on Geopolitics Tiberius D. Go check out that playlist. North America, I think, really speaks for itself. Obviously, you're not going to get a lot of economic activity from the Hudson Bay because while it's flat, it's incredibly cold. But if you're talking about the greater Mississippi Basin, aka the American Midwest, and the Atlantic Plain, this is where the vast majority of the American economic network is made. We have financing in New York City, in Philadelphia, in Washington, D.C. They do basically the administrative work. You have the southern Atlantic Plain there, which kind of was the early American breadbasket. Now it's kind of having a bit of an identity crisis because they're trying to do agriculture and mining and industrial work all at the same time. They are currently largely transitioning into industrial work, and that will work very well for them in that particular environment. So expect states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama are largely going to be America's new factory belt. Talk about the old Rust Belt, though. It worked for a reason. It was there largely due to the fact that it could source the greater Mid-Lakes, which means that you had locomotion because you could get on the water, but also you're where the food's grown. You're where the stuff's mined. And so Detroit is not where it is by accident. It's where you can get the steel and the labor and the materials to build the modern car. Midwest is kind of primed out to be some of the best geography on the planet. And then, of course, you get California's there for a reason. It's got some of the best climate in the world. Long Valley actually has some of the best topography in the world. It's just the Sierra Nevada around it that sucks. Kind of the same thing going on for Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland, Oregon. You're in that coastal plain. It's great. Got a very Mediterranean-esque climate. Really nice. But you can't interact with anybody around you because you have to punch through mountains or a plateau. South America is a great example of if you are in the wrong spot, you're screwed. I could spend hours talking about this. Country Spotlight episodes are needed. Paying the crap out of me, make sure I get those done. Brazil has problems. The fact that they're there when they have the largest rainforest in the world and they have a coastal plateau means they really should fail. The reason that they haven't is that they have poured everything that they could into facilitating a modern economic structure, and they've been able to make it successful. That with their current government and what's going on with world politics, this is probably the end of modern Brazil, and we're going to see Brazil fall the hell apart. The country that matters here really is Argentina. They should be doing the best, but if you know anything about their governing structure, I haven't done a spotlight on them in a very long time. I don't even think the old one's up. But Argentina just can't govern itself. Otherwise, it has the perfect climate, the perfect geography. Argentina should be the powerhouse of South America, and it's not, and that's solely on them. I will break that down in a country spotlight, tell you guys what's going on there, why it can't. And then, of course, everywhere else you can see how everything's divided. You've got incredible geographic barriers that keep the coastal plateaus or the coastal areas from interacting from the interlands. And so whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Colombia, whether it is Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Paraguay, is that you're pretty much bordered off from everywhere. If you look at human history, even with what we don't know exactly in prehistory, South America is the most peaceful continent on the planet by far. it's really hard to fight your neighbors because you've got massive barriers in the way where you can't interact with them. The only major wars that have been fought in South America was largely between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. These were the big ones. And if anyone else was in there, like Bolivia and Chile in the Pacific War, that was largely decided in pretty quick order because of the geography there. The one thing that I haven't talked about, and I kind of forgot this in the notes, was the resource scattering. If you're in areas that are in oceanic zones and where the geography kind of lines up with that, you're probably got a little bit of an issue that you can't source resources. We'll hit this in the conclusions. But in the general level here is that continental areas that have these highlands, they're usually incredibly mineral rich. But your ability to source into them is incredibly dependent upon the geography that you have. And so if you're dealing with North America, which is largely flat, you can get into those continental areas far better because it's very slowly sloped from Denver all the way over to St. Louis and then back up into Pittsburgh. That's nice. You don't have that in most of, particularly the southern part of the planet. If you're interacting with South America, Africa, and to even a significant degree Australia, you are in the place that you want to live, and then the place where you want to mine is on the mountain chain 100 miles over, and you have to do a lot of building to get there. Let's wrap it all into some nice little parts. This is how much it costs to move things by its locomotion. And the lower you go on this list, you will notice the more that it doesn't care about geography. Transportation by water requires either a coastline or it requires a major river system that you can, either dam or levee or what have you. So the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Rhine, these relatively flat rivers that have quite a bit of water on them, you can float something on. It's the cheapest way to move anything. There's usually a race between water and pipelines. This is the way that we actually moved bulk commodities for most of human history. In fact, this is why Egypt has been such a major cultural pressure, even if it's been occupied or not, for the last 6,000 years. Egypt is relatively flat. It can grow because of the Nile. The climate sucks, actually, but because it's ample access to water transportation and water sourcing, because the Nile is actually very consistent, they are able to have, at least in antiquity, one of the most prosperous and effective civilizations in history. Pipelines are a little weird. They are basically competitive with water because they are water, but in the opposite way. They go over land, but you're transferring a liquid, condensed gas through from one place to another. The problem is that if you have a pipeline that has a massive change in elevation, it'll pop because you got to pump it all the way up. And then once it starts coming down, it's got hydraulic pressure. If you have a bunch of water coming down a mountain, even if it's in a pipe, it will very much like to pop that pipe. It's very dependent upon changes in elevation. Rail is the next one. Rail is pretty much everywhere. I'm not going to say rail doesn't work, but the whole thing about rail is that it radically decreases in efficiency per each percent of grade. If you ever go driving and you notice that you see rail and you'll have the road going up and down, but the rail's largely flat, it is done for a reason. Because a 1% grade or 2% grade, your car doesn't carry too much about it, but when you're dealing with multi-million pound trains, that 1% grade really gets problematic really quickly. Don't even think about something like a 4% grade or a 6% grade. There's a few places out there that stretch it. You've got some places in California and Wyoming that are really high grade, but they literally have to shove engine upon engine to get it to go through that area. Trucks are a lot more expensive. The good news is, and the bad news is this, trucks are not actually as expensive as that looks. Trucks are there for two reasons. One, they outcompete rail because they're faster. And this is something the Americans really need to have a conversation on. The interstate was a wonderful thing. You need an interstate system for rail. Doesn't even have to be high speed, but getting a freight train that can rapidly load stuff from A to B and then go up to 70 miles an hour and then drop it off somewhere else, you will radically see trucking completely change if you do that. Because trains would love to do that, but they can't because they don't have the infrastructure system that we put into motor vehicles in the same way that the trains do. Just they're actually not super competitive in that regard. And so trucks are now dominating American locomotion. We probably should fix that because you will have cheaper goods and services if you can move things back to rail, but that requires a big upfront cost in the infrastructure. Trucking is there, it's good, but you really kind of want it there from point to point and end of line destinations. You really want rail to be the first part that does the high bulk, high volume, flatter land stuff, and then when you need to run stuff up a mountain, you can do it on a truck. There is only one reason why air is on here, and it's kind of the same reason for trucks, but more by extension. It's fast. Trucks are significantly faster than rail, and if rail can be competitive on time and speed, trucking is going to get reinvented, and it should. Air is, I don't know if y'all have ever flown in a plane before, but I drove across the continent. It took me 4 days to get from the state of Washington back to my home state of Indiana. 4 days, usually about 8-hour stints. I did the plane trip in 4 hours. So literally for every day, I can do an hour in a plane ride. It's expensive as hell, but you save so much time. You all know the expression, time is money. And if you can save that level of time, you are going to be massively cost competitive. That is really the only reason that air travel works. But quite honestly, it should be their last resort. Look at how much more expensive it is than anything else. You're talking by a factor of 10 on some of these. It's insane. So this graphic was done in revenue per ton mile. Let's move it all together, and we're going to talk about geography and the infrastructure overall. Talked about scarcity. Having resources is often a game changer. If you have the Australian deposits of all the things that they have, that's what's feeding the modern Australian economy right now, is being a modern exporter of raw goods and commodities out to the wider world. Aluminum, steel, iron ore, that kind of thing. Ship it out in the wider world, be processed. You're the first link in the chain. European coal, it was incredibly important. That's what kicked off the Industrial Revolution, at least within Europe. Having that access to that power source is incredibly important, incredibly powerful. And without that, I don't think the Industrial Revolution would have happened in Europe. Middle Eastern oil, everyone runs off of this now or is associated by that. It's straightforward. I mean, they're rich because they have it. They don't even consume it themselves. They literally have somebody come in, mine it out of the ground. They reap a huge percentage of the profit, and then they sell it off down line to people who need it. Believe it or not, most of the Middle Eastern countries, while they have oil, actually use less oil than most people around. They don't need it. And then North American deposits. Basically, the United States has been a superpower because not only does it have a wonderful climate and a largely wonderful geography, it's also got a large deposit network of things that it needs. It's got Kentucky coal. It's got Texas oil. It used to have Arkansas bauxite, which is aluminum. It's largely had almost every major industrial commodity through the entire phase that we have transitioned to, whether it was early industrialization, mid-industrialization, or late industrialization. We kind of have it all. There's a few things that we don't have, but it's very rare. For those who don't have the things, you have to find a way. So, United Kingdom did very well at the beginning of the industrial period because it had the coal. But what happens when it doesn't have coal anymore? Or more particularly, what happens whenever something you find better, say oil? There's no oil in the United Kingdom, so you have to go out. But this is literally the major fights for Germany and Japan, and to some degree Poland. Germany didn't have access to oil, so let's kill Russia. Japan literally launched a war of empire because of the fact that they didn't have nothing. Japan is the most resource-starved economy on the planet. They have to import like everything. The Japanese home islands, which I have a country spotlight up, by the way. Definitely go check that one out. Japan just isn't resourcefully competitive. They had to find another way. And they did. They got nuked, and then they found another way after that. Poland failed, largely because of this. Poland has resource reserves, but they weren't able to collect their reserves in a way that made them competitive with the Germans on one side and the Russians on the other, and they were just completely wiped out by them. And that's why, modern Poland is kind of in the state that it's in. It doesn't have the ability to force project against its rivals because I'm not saying it's resource deprived, but it has resource scarcity issues, particularly in the modern era where you need oil. That's why they are always complaining about the Russian energy issues. Suck infrastructure. Easing the cost of transportation is the game changer. If you make $10 instead of $1, you absolutely want to do it. And as I've illustrated out, it's still limited by geography. But put it this way, if you want to go back to that one slide of which you can do, if you can't do water, then you do pipe. If you can't do pipe, then you do rail. If you can't do rail, you do truck. And I'm going to say it just pretty much this way. If you can't build a modern rail infrastructure because your geography sucks, you are probably not going to have a modern nation state. But if you can, and you don't have one, build one, because it will make you heaps and gobbles of money. Let's get political. Let's get to the last one. All right, so social safety nets. Everyone likes to talk about these. How do we make people better? How do we make more wealth? Well, here's the thing. I'm going to come out straight out of the gate. Most of these don't make good money, but they have decent returns. They're actually, if you want to think about it, social safety nets are there as a maintenance function, not as a wealth generation function, but they can have some very positive effects. I'm going to just hit it all now that we pretty much all do it all wrong, believe it or not. All the things that we really should be doing, we're not doing, and all the things that we are doing are actually incredibly toxic. Let's talk about the things that we want to do, that we want to encourage. Number one, if you are a gamer, you may understand the concept of achievement unlocked. And that is getting people to do things by rewarding them for doing it and further rewarding them to do more of it. One of the most efficient, effective programs the United States ever did was a program called Cash for Clunkers. You may have heard about this, you may have forgotten about it, you may be too young. We incentivized people getting newer, energy efficient cars with better fuel mileage and better safety standards. And while there was market distortions and things that happened, the average age of the average vehicle on the road went down, the average fuel efficiency went up, and the average safety rating on a car went up. This is something that you absolutely want to reward people for doing, because if you have higher gas mileage, you have more safety. The gas mileage will save you day to day because you are spending less on fuel, and the safety means that in the event that something bad happens, by the DOT assessment, every life is worth about $11 million. That means that there's $11 million that are still active within the economic circulation that isn't taken out because you are dead. There's a few things that I'm going to get a little more political and social on. If you want to encourage education, then an achievement unlock program for graduating, whether it's high school, college, or whatever, we're like, hey, look, you did it. You met the terms and the qualifications that you need to do to be a successful thing. You are now certified. Here's $100 or $500 or $1,000. I don't care how much it is. If you reward people for doing the things that you want them to do, it's called incentive. I think you all know how this works. And we don't do any of this. And I don't know why. It's incredibly basic and rudimentary. Of course, me being a little bit more socially conservative, I'm going to say being a married parent is absolutely a win. We have seen this. It's more social than it is economic, but you can kind of wrap this around. A person who has two married parents, I don't even care if they're gay or they're trans or whatever, if they have two married parents raising them, that is a better financial stability, that is a better social stability, and that makes them far more productive. It makes them far more capable people in their adult lives because they weren't screwed up in the head. And that tends to be the overall case. And I'm sorry for those of you who are single parents out there or were raised by a single parent. This is not to drill on you. I'm glad that you are here. I'm glad that you made it. But we have statistically shown that if you have a two-parent household, you have a 7 times better chance at being a more functional, more capable adult. And that is the definitive data. One thing that I also had, and this is like the left-wing side of me, whistleblowing. Rewarding people for being like, hey, this guy's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. In fact, he's killing people or screwing you over. Rewarding that would actually be a good thing. I hate that people like Chelsea Manning were not made national heroes because they should be. I know I like to piss off the right on that one, but I'm 1,000% going to do that. If you believe in good conscience that your government or your institutions are not behaving the way that they're supposed to, you have a duty-bound obligation to do that. And a society that doesn't actually have like a Department of Justice that rewards that, quite honestly, has problems. Let's talk insurance. Insurance is actually weird because there's some really good ones in that and there's some really bad ones. I'll make it very simple. If you have auto, health, or property insurance, auto and property, pretty straightforward. If your house burned down, then you're only focused on retaining the value of your house, trying to get something back out of it. The fact that we leave these up to private entities actually bothers me a lot because it just makes general sense. You want to get people back on their feet as quickly as possible. Auto insurance, property insurance, these are the major facilitations of people in their life. We'll kind of couple that with housing here in a second. Getting them back on their feet as quickly as possible is a good thing. It will have a high return if you do. This is actually something that markets don't do well with. In particular, you can see this with health insurance. I do not want to openly say that government is incredibly good at anything. In fact, the government functionality part up there at the top, I kind of overlapped. This is all dependent on if you have a strong governing system that actually can get money to those who need it or support to those who need it. You can have the biggest budget in the world, but if no one gets it, then what's the point of that? Whether I am conservative or whether I am liberal or left, none of this works if you don't have a government that actually makes it work. So I want to be very clear about that. Housing is very straightforward in that I don't want to openly say it's good, but if you have a society with property rights and you have squatting laws, that kind of thing, you are actually going to make it to where that is an economic drain very, very quickly. Because if you want to throw somebody in jail because they just wanted to take a nap on your street corner, but if you throw them away in jail, that person is now taking money out of your system because you have to now put them in jail and feed them and deal with all that stuff and pay for the people arresting them. At the same time, they're no longer a tax-paying, contributing member of society. Housing actually, when it comes down to the money, might break even. And there's actually a real thing here. People living in New York City, San Diego, San Francisco, SeaTac, Chicago, you're dealing with a place that is so expensive to live, you really shouldn't live there if you're poor. I know that that's a big thing to say, but major urban areas are a playground for the rich. And quite honestly, the best thing that poor people could ever do is tell rich people to screw off or pay me a lot to be there because it's incredibly expensive. If you're talking about those areas, public housing is a disaster because you will never make it back. As long as you keep people from being arrested, they're usually better. They're a lot more productive and beneficial. Let's talk about the things that don't do work worth a crap. Some of these are going to be a little bit handed and some are not. Obviously, disability, I kind of covered this earlier. I hinted at it when we were talking about education. If somebody's disabled, I don't want to shit on them and be like, oh, hey, you drain on the state. Technically, you are, but there's a way to make that work. You can retool them. This is why education is so incredibly powerful. But if you're going to just simply say, hey, look, you're 30 years old, you broke your back, we'll just give you a check for the rest of your life, that's a net negative. You don't want to do that. That is the worst thing you could possibly do. You want to spend that same amount of money in re-educating them or repurposing or retooling them because you can still, even if you go for a liberal arts education, can get 20 more years of productivity out of them if you did a full reboot. Employment, kind of the same thing. We've got this idea that we need to have unemployment insurance, which I get. Like, I'm currently unemployed right now. I totally get where people are going to be like, hey, look, I need it. I kind of do. But it's far more beneficial not to give me a check for being unemployed. It's far more beneficial for giving me a check for being employed. You can give people bonuses for like, hey, were you on the job for 90 days? Cool, here's a week's pay. Or, you were on the job for a year? Cool, here's a month's pay. Something like that. I know that's a little ridiculous for some of you, but that is a positive incentive structure that can work. And it will absolutely eliminate 90% of the problems that you have with both of these insurances. Let's get to where it gets really spicy. Food stamps. We have to face the reality here. Food is one of the most subsidized and overcredited systems in the world. If you can't afford food, you are literally at the point of complete failure because that's the first thing you need. If you have gotten to the point where you can't afford food in a highly subsidized, highly regulatory environment that we are in right now where food prices are incredibly low and overly abundant even in the area of inflation, if you have an instance to where a person is so low on the totem pole that they can't even afford food, you have to retool that person. That person has gotten to the point where they cannot maintain their own biological function. I don't want to shit on people for getting to that point, but literally paying for anything else is way higher on the food chain. Literally paying for their housing would be more important than paying for their food. And then, of course, is the ultimate abysmal thing, which I have ranted on so many times before. Social Security is an absolute abomination because it takes from those who are net providers to the system and gives to those who are net takers. I know that I kind of have a thing for being openly ageist, but I'm just going to hit it this way. Social Security is not, hey, we're going to take some money back for you out of each paycheck and give it back to you. That originally was what it was supposed to be, but of course government screwed up and that's not the case anymore. What it is that it's a system that takes from those who are participating in the system, who are employees, who are young, who are participating in the system, and it takes from those who are not. Those are retirees. For every economic and social reason possible, you never want to do this. Because on the economic side is that these people will never give you a return ever again. They are retirees. They're not putting into the system. They're taking out of the system. And to let them take more is absolutely an abominable thing. If they haven't taken the entire lifetime that they can build up in savings and taking care of themselves and wisdom to where the point where they can't retire, we need to have a chat about that. Because that's not a failure of them as much as it is a failure of the system. Because if you can't get to that level of prosperity, then the system's screwed up. The other side of that is that socially, this is a disaster too. And I'm going to just insert my own opinion and political philosophy here. Retirement homes should never freaking exist. And the fact that we have them in the number that we do is entirely funded off of largely Social Security. Oh, hey, dad has a check. Cool. You know, just let him go die off in the nice home. The fact that we allow this in any civilized society is demonstrably barbaric to me. Stop doing this, because this is the number one thing that the United States government spends its money on, is trying to keep old people prospered up in a position that they shouldn't be in the first place. Hot and spicy. Let's hit the final notes real quick, and then we'll close it all out. There are places that are helped because of climate and the geography. Anglo-America, aka the United States and Canada, really do well because of their climate and their geography. Northern Europe, obviously, I hinted at, has a really good intersection of that. Places that are hurt are largely Africa, particularly Sub-Saharan Africa. Northern Africa actually is more of an extension of Europe. But Sub-Saharan Africa and South America are just horrific. They tend to be very hot. They tend to be incredibly hilly, if not cliff-like. This is the areas where the equator is. If technology is changing the game, and it has before, the two places that you want to watch is India and Indonesia. Air conditioners do make it to where you can be productive in hot weather. That really makes India and Indonesia competitive if they can afford it. It takes quite a bit of capital costs that you're not putting into other things, but if you can make it up for in productivity, if air conditioners are actually worth it, India and Indonesia are the places to watch. Also, their topography, a little goofy, but Indonesia, largely flat. If they can build the roads and the infrastructure they can get into and out of the islands, that's a win. And they can turn the corner on that one. India, largely like the same thing. They've got some bad topography here and there. But if they can export what they make and what they accrue within the subcontinent, remind you, it's a giant diamond. And the entire bottom parts of the diamond, which is longer, is all ocean bound. You can literally put it on a boat and go. There's some problems with topography in that. Largely the western side is more hilly and more mountainous. But if you can see people make a difference with infrastructure in particular, it's India. So those are the places to watch. If they can succeed, then we may have changed the game, and semi-tropical zones might be on the radar for the next places to look at as a boom. Government spending, first things you want to spend on is education, energy efficient machinery, and infrastructure. And the last note I want to hit on is that don't spend it on green tech because it's flawed. And that will be my next presentation. So everyone, thank you so much for this extended presentation. We are at 1 hour and 30 minutes. I'm so sorry for those of you who are wanting to play the game. We will get to that here in a minute. But the long story short here is that I want to thank you so much for watching this. Whether you are just a supporter of my work, you really wanted to just kind of mix it up. If you have questions or comments, definitely leave them in chat. Leave them down below. I will try to answer them in the afterlog. But next time, we're going to be talking about green energy. We're actually just going to be talking about the energy industry in general. But we're going to be talking about the green energy and why it's pretty much the impossible future. There are some things that will work. There are some things that won't. In fact, most of it won't. What will work constructively and productively is out there. But we have to have a serious chat on what is attainable and what is not under today's technology. And even what tomorrow's technology might be is far more limited than what you might think. If you want to help us out for all the time, the effort that we did, whether building out this presentation, actually presenting it to you in the way that you have seen, if you like it, if you are on Twitch, you can always sub. You can gift sub. You can do that kind of thing. There is a donation link down below. If you are watching on YouTube, there is also a donation link down below. We haven't been able to monetize on YouTube yet. We need to get to that 1,000 subscriber mark. Help us do that by liking, sharing, and telling all your friends about this wonderful presentation. If you want to help in other ways, we have an Amazon wish list. If you just want to help me directly, if it's still on there, the hammer and the pickaxe would actually be incredibly beneficial to me for some of my home maintenance needs right now. So we would really appreciate that. Other things that you can do. We have a Patreon. Right now, that's kind of the big way for YouTube. I'm sorry I missed that one. But if you want to help me out and you're on the YouTube audience in particular, or you just want to help me out in general, Patreon, best way to do that too. Merchandise is down below. There's a bunch of stuff with the Geopolitics label, if you're a Mask Off fan, that kind of stuff, or just my own personal Tyberius logo. All those are things that you can find. I got t-shirts, I've got hoodies, I've got all these wonderful things that you can check out. So yeah, I'm done shilling. I hope that you guys like this presentation. I can't wait to see what chat is saying. And until next time, I have been Tyberius D, and we'll catch you next time. First question from Baked Cupcake on Twitch. What do you think about immigration in relation to climate change? Will it be mostly successful for those who are migrating? That's a really big one because we don't know exactly what climate change is going to bring. I know a lot of people are like, oh, hey, well, world's going to catch on fire or, this and that. The problem is what's the scale and the speed that this happens, right? So if it's something that we see over the next century, it'll actually be kind of like the pot or the frog in the boiling pot kind of deal, to where people will move from place to place. It'll be economically destructive, absolutely. But overall, in the general sense, is that people will move from where they can prosper and thrive from where they could prosper and thrive to another place where they think they can. Does it mean they're going to hit it every time right? No. In fact, Eurasia is probably going to be horrible. But if climate change is going to operate as bad as what some people think, then we're going to see civilizational collapse on a level we've never before seen. And thus, I would say don't worry about it because you can't even stop it. If it's something that's more manageable, you're kind of hoping for a package of technologies that can reverse the trend. We are nowhere near close to a carbon neutral society, let alone a carbon negative one. Next, FloatU32 on Twitch. After all the conservative talking points you rattled off, how can you reconcile your ideology with the U.S. lagging behind basically every developed Western nation in happiness and life expectancy? I can make it very, very easily. Number one, they're not. They don't have kids. And I think that's a huge thing that no one talks about. They basically front end their societies to where it's like, hey, yeah, we've got you medical care and we've got you this and that, but they don't actually get down to the brass tacks. They don't have militaries that can defend them from, like, the Russians. We have to do it for them. And then second is that if you don't have anyone to carry on your great, wonderful nation because you don't believe in it, then how can you tell me you're a great and wonderful nation? Like, I don't get this. I'm not saying for anyone in chat that you need to have kids to be happy. I'm saying if you have a happy, productive, and prosperous society, then you would want to have kids in that society. It seems incredibly ass backwards to me that people are like, oh, well, kids are terrible. I'm like, kids are the definitive sign to me that you have a socially, economically, and politically healthy society. The fact that we're seeing Europe turning into an old folks home doesn't mean that they're doing things better than us. It's just, to me, they're writing it out before they have to turn the lights off. So I actually absolutely reject this notion. It's just literally left-wing cope for me, is that, oh yeah, the people that we want really are just putting up all the good things because they have a great Gini coefficient or whatever. Every problem that the Americans have, the Europeans have, it's just in a different facet. No Western nation has actually been able to deal with the damage that globalization has done. We have seen middle classes either or basically solidify, if not shrink, everywhere. I'm not going to... I just definitively disagree with this assessment that they're doing better. They're doing better in some ways, like some people are just saying that they're happier, but I don't buy it. I really don't. Next question from GSU Gambit, a good friend of mine on Twitch. At Tyberius D, caught the last 20 minutes. Good stuff. I appreciate that. Listen, someone else talked about wildlife in certain areas that aided economies, but I guess this wrapped up in terrain as land as well. Yes and no. One of the biggest things in human history that has been a massive economic advantageous thing is animal husbandry. One of the biggest reasons to why North America wasn't able to flourish in the same way that Europe did, even though it has a very similar geography, is that it didn't have cows, pigs, horses, basically all these things that we make for the core building blocks of modern life. They didn't have wheat, they didn't have barley. A lot of this all comes from Eurasia, and it didn't get to North America until the Europeans started coming over, exploring and colonizing. And then, of course, when you see that, the geographic areas of North America that have a similar implementation to Europe just take off. This is why the 13 colonies and Canada in particular are some of the hardest hitting places in the world, is just that they have a climatological and geographic point that reflects very well in our social, economic, and if you will, like our technological package that we have now developed as humans, and to a degree that makes them incredibly prosperous. You disagree by citing them that they have kids when they actually have more. Well, I'll just put it this way. I did a presentation on that, which is on YouTube right now. You can go check it out. It's called Demography, the End of Normal. Europe is an old folks home. All of Europe. Western Europe stopped having kids basically during Gen X. So if you don't believe me, the data's there. You can check census bureaus across the planet, or just ours, because they report everybody. Yeah, Europe stopped having kids a long time ago. There's only like 3 or 4 countries that kind of stopped or kind of kept going. The United Kingdom is largely made up for it with immigration. France has actually kept a remarkably higher birth rate, but we don't know how much of that is like ordinary French people versus the immigrants that have came in over the last 100 years, because collecting ethnic and religious data is actually illegal in France. They could be doing what the Russians are doing, where, yeah, they have kids, but it's not actually like ethnic Russians who believe in the society that are having it. It's all the people who have come in, like the Tartars and whatnot. I hate to like get into the ethnocentric shit, but if you have a people that don't agree with what the society writ large even agrees with, who are having all the kids, then you're kind of doomed to failure. So France could either be the next great European nation because you've got a bunch of French kids for some reason, or you're going to see the most social strife and hardline right-wing government form in France because they're all not French. And that may have something to do with the fact that we are seeing Le Pen, even though she has lost, keep gaining steam, even though she's losing time and time again. The other thing, well, if you ignore the facts that happy nations with the healthcare do worse than the U.S., at least you can buy an assault rifle at effing supermarket. I'm going to emphasize that this is a politically biased conversation, because it's easy to be like, oh, hey, we're happy because we do this, this, and this. And I can do the same thing. I can be like, no, we're happier because we have this, this, and this. But I'm going to simply put down that I have a really hard time believing that a people who believe that they have a good society and a happy society and a prosperous society are not going to pass it on to another generation. If you're looking for some of the places that I think are actually happier and more prosperous, Latin America is happier. You're looking at Indonesia as a lot happier. Nigeria is a lot happier. And you know what? I would believe that too. Because while they may not have a chicken in every pot, they have their families, they have their friends, and they have their communities, which is something the West has absolutely took a big old piss on.